The roadside diner was the kind of place where time seemed to stand still. A squeaky screen door, the smell of sizzling bacon, and a jukebox playing old country tunes. It was a quiet spot for travelers and locals alike. On most days, it was peaceful, but today was different. A gang of bikers roared into the gravel parking lot, their engines echoing through the countryside. They were loud, brash, and looking for trouble. Inside, the diner's patrons exchanged nervous glances as the bikers barged in, leather jackets creaking and boots thudding against the tiled floor. They took over a booth by the window, barking orders at the waitress and tossing out crude jokes that made everyone uncomfortable. Sitting at the far end of the counter was an older man, his weathered hands wrapped around a coffee cup. He wore a faded flannel shirt and a dusty baseball cap, the kind of guy who looked like he belonged to the land. He didn't say much, just sipped his coffee and kept his eyes on the bikers. One of them, a tall guy with a skull tattoo, noticed the farmer's calm demeanor. "What's the matter, old-timer? You scared of us?" he sneered, slapping his hand on the counter for effect. The farmer didn't flinch, just looked up slowly, his piercing gaze cutting through the noise like a knife. "Not scared," he said simply, his voice steady and low. The bikers laughed, but there was something unsettling about the farmer's composure. As the laughter died down, he stood up, placing a few bills on the counter. "Enjoy your meal," he said, walking toward the door. But as he passed by the bikers, he paused just long enough to mutter something under his breath. Whatever he said made the leader's smirk falter for the first time. And just like that, the mood in the diner shifted. The bikers exchanged puzzled glances as the farmer stepped out into the warm afternoon sun, the door creaking shut behind him. His truck was parked near the edge of the lot, an old rust-covered pickup that had clearly seen better days. He moved with a deliberate slowness, as if he had all the time in the world. But there was something in his demeanor, a quiet confidence, that didn't sit right with the gang. Inside the diner, the atmosphere grew tense. The waitress avoided eye contact, her hands trembling slightly as she refilled coffee cups. A couple of regulars shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure whether to stay or leave. The bikers were still laughing, but their bravado felt forced, especially from their leader. He glanced toward the window, watching the farmer climb into his truck. "What did he say to you?" one of the bikers asked, nudging the leader. "Nothing important," he muttered, though his jaw tightened. He wasn't used to being rattled, but something about the old man's calmness had struck a nerve. "Just some old farmer trying to act tough," he added, brushing it off. Still, his eyes stayed fixed on the truck as it rumbled to life. The truck didn't pull away immediately. Instead, it idled there for a moment, the farmer's silhouette visible through the dusty windshield. Was he watching them? Planning something? The thought made the leader shift in his seat. "Let's go show him who's boss," one of the younger bikers suggested, his voice full of adrenaline and false confidence. But the leader hesitated. He hated backing down, yet something told him this wasn't the fight they wanted. Still, his pride wouldn't let him walk away just yet. "Finish up your food," he said, forcing a grin. "We'll deal with him soon enough." Outside, the truck finally pulled onto the road. But instead of speeding away, it slowed just past the diner, as if waiting. The bikers finished their food quickly, their chatter growing louder as they psyched themselves up. The leader leaned back in his seat, trying to mask his unease. "He's just an old man," he said, more to himself than anyone else. Probably just bluffing. But deep down, he wasn't so sure. Outside, the sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the countryside. The group piled back onto their motorcycles, revving their engines loudly enough to rattle the windows of the diner. They sped off down the road, following the path the farmer's truck had taken. The leader rode at the front, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of the pickup. After a few miles, they spotted it, parked near the edge of a sprawling field, its tailgate down. The farmer stood nearby, leaning casually against the side of the truck as if he'd been expecting them. Behind him stretched acres of golden crops, swaying gently in the evening breeze. It was a picturesque scene, but something about it felt off. Too quiet, too still. The bikers pulled up in a cloud of dust, their engines growling as they formed a semicircle around the truck. The leader cut his engine and swung his leg off the bike, striding toward the farmer with a forced smirk. "Looks like you've got yourself a little audience," he said, gesturing to his crew. The farmer didn't respond right away. He took a long look at the group, then down at the ground, as if considering something. "This land's been in my family for generations," he said finally, his voice calm but firm. "I've worked it, protected it, and I don't take kindly to anyone thinking they can push me around." The leader laughed, but it sounded hollow. "We're not here for your land, old man. We just don't like people talking tough and walking away." The farmer gave a small, knowing smile. "You sure about that?" he asked, nodding toward the field behind him. The leader squinted at the field, unsure of what the farmer was hinting at. From where they stood, it looked like any other quiet stretch of farmland, nothing but rows of crops swaying in the fading light. But the way the old man stood there, calm as ever, made it feel like they were missing something. "You trying to scare us with some corn and dirt?" One of the bikers jeered, his voice breaking the uneasy silence. A few others laughed, their confidence bolstered by the open space and their numbers. The farmer didn't answer. He took a step forward, his boots crunching softly against the gravel. "This isn't just land to me," he said, his tone steady. "It's a place that's taught me everything I know, about survival, about reading people, and about handling situations like this." The bikers exchanged uncertain glances. The leader forced another laugh, but it was clear the farmer's unshakable confidence was starting to get under his skin. "Enough with the speeches," he said, pulling a step closer. "You think you're tougher than us. Let's see what you've got." The farmer tilted his head slightly, studying the group like a seasoned poker player sizing up his opponents. "You don't get it, do you?" he said quietly. "This isn't about me versus you. It's about understanding what you've walked into." As he spoke, the wind shifted, carrying a faint, rhythmic sound from the field behind him. At first, it was barely noticeable, a soft rustling that could have been the breeze. But as the bikers strained to listen, the sound grew louder, more deliberate, like something moving steadily through the crops. "What's that?" one of them muttered, his bravado faltering. The farmer's eyes didn't leave the leader. "Like I said," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "This land's been in my family for generations, and some things, they're better left undisturbed." The rustling grew closer, the air thick with tension. The bikers' engines, once deafening, now seemed small and powerless against the eerie stillness closing in around them. The bikers stood frozen, their bravado cracking as the rustling sound crept closer. What had seemed like an easy confrontation was quickly turning into something else entirely. The leader clenched his jaw, unwilling to show fear, but his eyes flicked toward the field, searching for an explanation. The crops moved in waves, bending and swaying as though something large was weaving through them, something unseen. "Okay, old man, enough games," the leader snapped, trying to regain control of the situation. "What's out there?" The farmer didn't answer right away. He turned toward the field, his gaze steady and knowing. "Funny thing about this land," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "It remembers. Every storm, every season, every footstep. And it has its own way of dealing with things that don't belong." Before anyone could respond, the rustling stopped. The air grew heavy, the silence pressing in on them like a weight. Then, out of nowhere, the sound shifted, sharp, sudden movements now coming from multiple directions. It wasn't just one thing in the field, it was several. The biker's confidence wavered further. "What the hell is this?" one of them whispered, gripping his handlebars tightly. The farmer turned back to face them, his expression unreadable. "You came here thinking you'd call the shots," he said calmly. "But this place, it doesn't answer to you. And neither do I." A deep guttural growl echoed from the crops, followed by another and another, each one more menacing than the last. The bikers stepped back instinctively, their bravado evaporating with every sound. The leader reached for the chain on his belt, his hand trembling slightly. "Is this some kind of trick?" he barked, his voice breaking. The farmer didn't move. "You wanted a fight," he said simply. "But you picked the wrong ground." He glanced back at the field, his lips curling into a faint smile. "Now you've got to answer to it." Before anyone could process his words, the crops erupted in chaos. Something was coming, and it wasn't waiting for an invitation. The bikers barely had time to react before the field came alive. Shapes burst from the crops, large, shadowy figures moving with unnatural speed. In the dim light, it was hard to tell what they were. They weren't animals, at least not any the bikers recognized. Low growls filled the air, mixed with the rustling of leaves and the scrape of claws against dirt. Whatever these things were, they were closing in fast. The bikers scattered instinctively, their bravado completely gone. Engines roared to life as they tried to backtrack toward the road, but the shadows moved faster, cutting off their escape routes. One of the bikers, the youngest of the group, let out a panicked shout as something darted past him, close enough to knock his bike off balance. "What asterisk is asterisk this?" he screamed, his voice breaking. The leader, still gripping his chain, spun in circles, trying to get a clear view of what they were facing. "Stay together," he yelled, his tone more desperate than commanding. But the group was already in chaos, scattering in different directions as the shadows herded them like prey. Through the chaos, the farmer stood calm and unmoving by his truck, watching the scene unfold. His face showed no malice, just a quiet resolve, as though he knew this was how it had to be. The leader locked eyes with him, his anger boiling over. "You planned this?" he shouted, his voice shaking. "Call them off." The farmer raised an eyebrow. "It's not my call," he said simply. "You stepped onto this land thinking you owned it. Now it's reminding you who's really in charge." Just as the leader lunged toward the farmer, one of the shadows broke from the pack and rushed him. But instead of striking, it stopped inches away, snarling low in his face. Up close, it was clear. The creatures weren't fully natural. They were like twisted reflections of animals, their forms warped and unnatural. And then, just as quickly, they disappeared back into the field. The bikers froze, breathing heavily as the rustling faded into the distance. The farmer leaned against his truck, his gaze steady. "Get off my land," he said, his voice calm but firm. "And don't come back." The leader hesitated, his pride and fear at war. But the look in the farmer's eyes, and the memory of those shadows, left no room for argument. Without another word, he climbed onto his bike and motioned for the others to follow. One by one, they sped off, their engines roaring down the dirt road until the sound faded into the night. The farmer stood there a moment longer, watching the horizon. Then, with a small sigh, he climbed into his truck. As he pulled away, the field behind him grew still again, as though nothing had ever happened. But if you listened closely, you could almost hear the land breathing, waiting for the next trespasser bold enough to test it. As the dust settled and the roar of the bikers' engines faded into the distance, the countryside returned to its usual calm. The fields swayed gently in the breeze, and the last light of the setting sun bathed the land in a warm golden glow. The farmer's old truck bumped along the dirt road, its headlights cutting through the deepening dusk. Inside the cab, the farmer glanced at the rearview mirror, his weathered face unreadable. He didn't seem triumphant or angry, just at peace, as though everything had unfolded exactly as it should. He reached for the radio and tuned it to an old country station. A familiar song crackled to life, filling the quiet with a comforting melody. Back at the diner, the waitress stood at the window, watching the road where the bikers had disappeared. She let out a shaky breath, her hands still trembling slightly. "What just happened?" one of the regulars asked, his voice low. The waitress shook her head, unsure how to answer. "I don't know," she said softly, "but I don't think they'll be coming back." The farmer drove home, the tires of his truck crunching over the gravel driveway. As he parked by the barn, he took a moment to step out and breathe in the cool evening air. The land stretched out before him, quiet and vast, holding secrets only he seemed to understand. He gave a small nod toward the fields, almost as if acknowledging them, before heading inside.